Because no one should die alone. The words sounded hollow in the interrogation chamber, swallowed by steel walls and recycled air that smelled faintly of ozone and burnt circuitry, and Staff Sergeant Caleb Hayes stood at attention in scuffed combat boots, while the overhead lights reflected off the carbon scoring on his armor like quiet accusations. The room measured maybe 12 feet by 12, barely large enough for the metal table bolted to the floor, and the two officers seated across from him, their uniforms crisp, their expressions unreadable, and beyond the reinforced glass panel behind them, he could see only his own faint reflection, broad shoulders, pale skin smudged with soot, blue eyes that hadn't slept in over 20 hours. "You were given a direct extraction order at 1900 hours, one of the officers said, voice calm, almost gentle, the way someone might address a malfunctioning machine. Orbital sweep scheduled at 1908. Your squad was accounted for, yet you remained inside the strike zone." Caleb's jaw tightened slightly as a diagnostic tone chirped from the damaged wrist unit still locked around his arm, its cracked display frozen at 32% power, a silent reminder of how close the margin had been. Outside the chamber, the distant hum of the base's ventilation system echoed like wind moving through a canyon of metal, and for a split second he was back there, back under a copper sky streaked with smoke, the air tasting like ionized dust, the ground vibrating under boots as distant artillery thudded somewhere beyond the ridge. The officers waited. "Why did you stay, Sergeant?" the second one asked. Caleb didn't answer right away. He remembered the way the battlefield had gone quiet in that strange, unnatural pause after the last transport lifted off, engines roaring upward in columns of white heat, leaving behind scattered debris and a landscape that felt too still for something that had just been chaos. His HUD had flashed red warnings across his visor. Extraction window closed. Strike in T-8 o'clock. Return to safe zone immediately. And he had turned to run, boots crunching over vitrified sand that shimmered like broken glass. That was when he heard it. Not a shout, not a threat, just a thin, wavering sound carried on the wind, almost lost beneath the static in his comms. He'd told himself it could have been anything, a loose panel, shifting metal, his imagination, but his steps had slowed anyway. "Sergeant Hayes," the first officer prompted, pen hovering over a digital pad. Caleb inhaled slowly, catching again that faint scent of scorched wiring from his armor's overloaded cooling system, and let the memory sharpen. He'd followed the sound past the shattered remains of a supply drone, past a half-collapsed barricade, until he saw her, small against the vast stretch of open terrain, skin a pale shade of blue that almost blended with the haze. One arm braced against the ground, as if she'd been trying to crawl toward nothing in particular. No weapon in sight. No insignia visible through the dust. Just wide golden eyes that locked onto his visor, as if he were the last solid thing left in the universe. His timer had ticked down, T-6:12, and the sky had begun to glow faintly from distant thrusters repositioning for the sweep. "You understand," the second officer said carefully, "that remaining in that zone placed you at extreme personal risk." Caleb's gaze shifted from the metal table to the glass, where his reflection seemed almost like a stranger. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. The question lingered in the air, heavier than any piece of gear he'd ever carried. "Why did you stay?" He remembered the way the wind had tugged at the torn fabric near her shoulder, the way her breathing had hitched like someone trying not to panic, the way every instinct drilled into him for 10 years had shouted to move, to survive, to follow protocol. Instead, he had taken one step toward her, then another. Back in the interrogation room, Caleb finally lifted his chin slightly. "You asked why I stayed," he said, voice steady despite the exhaustion threading through it. "Because when I looked at her, I didn't see an enemy. I saw someone who thought she'd been left behind." The officer's pen stopped moving, but the silence did not break. It only deepened, settling over the room like dust after a distant blast, and Caleb could feel their eyes measuring him the way scanners measured structural integrity, looking for cracks, for hesitation, for anything that could be labeled as failure instead of choice. "You were not ordered to conduct search and recovery," the first officer said at last, voice steady. "The zone was declared non-salvageable." Caleb nodded once, because that part was true. The countdown had been bright red across his visor, numbers shrinking with mechanical indifference. 8 minutes collapsing into 7 as the sky above the ridge shimmered with repositioning craft. He remembered lowering his rifle slowly, palms open to show he meant no harm, boots crunching over hardened sand as he closed the distance between them. Her breathing had been shallow, visible in the cool evening air, and when he knelt beside her the wind carried the faint scent of metallic dust and something sharper, like overheated circuitry. Up close he could see that she was younger than he first thought, not a soldier hardened by years, but someone barely grown, her pale blue skin streaked with dirt, golden eyes wide and fixed on him, as if waiting for the final blow that never came. "Do you understand me?" he had asked through the external speaker of his helmet, keeping his tone low and even. The translator in his suit hesitated for half a second before relaying the words in her language. Her lips parted, but no sound came out at first. Then, barely audible, a single word. "Left." It was not an accusation. It was confusion. His timer had ticked down to 6 minutes and 12 seconds. A distant tremor rolled through the ground as high-altitude engines shifted position. Protocol demanded he mark her location and withdraw. Instead, he reached for the compact medical kit clipped to his thigh. The officers in the present leaned forward slightly. "You rendered aid," the second one said. It was not quite a question. Caleb could still feel the stiffness in his gloves as he adjusted the pressure band on her shoulder, careful, deliberate, focused on stabilizing rather than assessing blame. He did not see insignia. He did not see allegiance. He saw a pulse at her throat, fast but steady. "You will miss your transport," she had whispered after the translator caught up, her voice thin but clear enough. He had glanced at the sky, where faint streaks of light hinted at what was coming. "I know," he answered. The wind picked up, tugging at loose fabric near her collar. She tried to push herself upright and failed, frustration flashing across her features before exhaustion softened it again. "Why?" she asked him, as if the concept itself did not fit within her understanding of the world. He remembered that question more clearly than the alarms. Why? Not who he was. Not what unit. Just why? In the interrogation room, the hum of the ventilation system filled the space between heartbeats. "Sergeant Hayes," the first officer pressed, "were you aware that the incoming strike would not differentiate between combatant and non-combatant?" Caleb met his gaze evenly. "Yes, sir." The pen hovered again. "Then explain your reasoning." Caleb exhaled slowly, the air cool against skin still marked by the faint imprint of his helmet seal. "There was no reasoning that would fit inside a report," he said. "There was a person on the ground who believed she had been abandoned. That was enough." The room stayed quiet after his last words, but silence had weight, and Caleb felt it pressing against his ribs the same way the thin atmosphere had pressed against his lungs out there on the open plain, the memory folding back over him without warning, as if the steel walls had dissolved and the copper sky had returned. The countdown in his visor had shifted from 6 minutes to 5, the numbers bright and unforgiving, and he had slid one arm under her shoulders, feeling how light she was compared to the gear he carried every day. She flinched at first, not from pain but from surprise, her golden eyes narrowing as if she expected a trick. "I cannot move fast," she had said quietly through the translator, her voice steadier now but still edged with fatigue. "Then we will not move fast," he replied, adjusting his grip and rising to his feet. His suit motors compensated with a low hum, internal servos redistributing weight as he lifted her, and a warning flashed about overheating in the right thigh actuator. He ignored it. The wind swept across the field in long, dry gusts that carried fine grit against his visor, and somewhere beyond the ridge he could hear the distant whine of engines repositioning, not close enough to shake the ground, but close enough to remind him that time was not on their side. "Your people left," she said after a few steps, her head resting briefly against the reinforced plate over his shoulder. He could not tell if it was a statement or a question. "Mine did too," he answered, scanning the terrain for the narrow ravine he remembered passing on the way in. Extraction ships did not wait for stragglers. They lifted when the clock said lift. Ahead, the land dipped slightly, forming a shallow depression shielded from direct line of sight. His HUD recalculated possible safe zones in shifting green lines, none of them ideal. For minutes and 20 seconds. "You will not reach your transport," she said again, softer now. He adjusted his course, boots sinking half an inch into loose soil before finding firmer ground beneath. Probably not, he admitted. The sky above had begun to change color, the faintest shimmer of atmospheric distortion forming high overhead, and his suit temperature ticked upward by 2 degrees as he increased speed. He could feel her breathing against his shoulder, uneven but steady, and the strange awareness that she had stopped looking away from him. Why risk this? She asked once more, and this time there was no confusion in it, only genuine curiosity, as if she were trying to solve an equation that did not balance. He did not slow down. Because leaving you there would have stayed with me longer than any strike ever could, he said. The ravine came into view at last, a narrow cut in the terrain no more than 15 feet deep, but angled enough to offer partial cover. 3 minutes and 12 seconds. He slid down carefully, boots scraping against packed earth, shielding her body from the jolt as best he could. The wind above seemed louder now, carrying a distant tremor through the air. He lowered her onto a relatively flat patch of ground and knelt beside her, checking the bandage he had secured earlier. Her eyes searched his faceplate as if trying to see past the tinted visor. If you stay, she said, you choose against your own command. He met her gaze through layers of composite glass and reinforced polymer. I chose when I picked you up, he replied, and as the timer dropped under 3 minutes, he keyed his comm unit off, cutting the last thin thread tying him to orders he no longer intended to follow. The moment he shut off his comm unit, the world seemed to narrow to the shallow ravine and the sound of his own breathing inside the helmet, steady but louder now that every external signal had gone silent. The countdown glowed at the edge of his vision, 2 minutes and 47 seconds, the numbers shifting with calm precision while the sky above carried a faint, distant tremor like an approaching storm. Aelira lay against the packed earth, her pale blue skin almost luminous in the filtered light that slipped down into the cut of land, golden eyes fixed on him with an intensity that no longer held fear, but something closer to disbelief. You severed contact, she said softly as the translator processed her words. Yes, Caleb replied, scanning the ridge line for any movement, though he knew the threat would not come from ground level. You understand what follows. It was not a warning. It was an acknowledgement. He adjusted the shielding on his suit, shifting the portable barrier module from his back to the ground beside them. It was designed for brief cover, rated for small arms and environmental debris, not for the kind of sweep scheduled to pass overhead, but it was what he had. He anchored it into the soil with a firm press, the mechanism unfolding with a metallic click and a faint blue shimmer rising between them and the open sky. The temperature inside the ravine dipped slightly as the wind shifted, carrying with it the low-frequency hum of high-altitude engines aligning. 2 minutes and 5 seconds. He crouched beside her, one knee in the dirt, and checked the readout on his wrist display. Her pulse, captured by the temporary sensor patch he had applied, held steady within acceptable range. Your people will mark this sector, she said, her gaze lifting briefly toward the sky before returning to him. If they see a signal from me, they may halt. He hesitated only a fraction of a second. Then send it, he answered. She raised her uninjured hand, fingers trembling slightly from exhaustion rather than hesitation, and touched the small metallic band at her collarbone. A faint glow pulsed beneath her skin, spreading outward in delicate lines that traced across her shoulder like light beneath ice. His visor flickered with a sudden spike in electromagnetic readings, the display filling with unfamiliar symbols before recalibrating. 1 minute and 20 seconds. Above them, the sky brightened, not with fire but with the unnatural glow of energy dispersing through upper atmosphere layers. The ground vibrated gently, a deep resonance that traveled through his boots and into his bones. He shifted closer, angling his body between her and the open edge of the ravine as the portable shield hummed louder, its power cell draining faster than he would have liked. If this fails, she said quietly, eyes searching his faceplate again, you will regret staying. He let out a slow breath. If I left, I would regret that more. The timer dropped under 40 seconds. The glow in the sky intensified, then hesitated, as if something unseen had intervened. His HUD flashed new data streams, external transmissions flooding the frequency bands he had muted moments earlier. A sharp tone signaled an override command sweeping through allied channels. The tremor in the ground softened. The brilliant haze above thinned rather than expanded. Caleb looked up instinctively, though the ravine walls limited his view to a narrow strip of sky where the light was now fading instead of growing. 20 seconds. 10. The countdown froze at 9 and dissolved into a blank field. Silence rushed in where tension had been, heavy and unreal. The portable shield powered down with a low sigh, its blue shimmer flickering out. Caleb kept his stance for several more heartbeats, waiting for a secondary alert that did not come. Slowly, he lowered himself back onto his heel. Aelira's hand fell from the glowing band at her collarbone, the light beneath her skin dimming to a faint trace. Somewhere high above, engines shifted tone, no longer aligning for destruction but redirecting, the sound drifting away like thunder rolling off into the distance. He met her gaze again, and this time there was no confusion in her expression at all, only understanding. For several long seconds Caleb did not move, his body still angled protectively toward Aelira, as if the sky might change its mind. But the glow above continued to fade into the dull copper haze of early evening, and the deep resonance in the ground dissolved into nothing more than the whisper of wind sliding over rock. His visor filled with new signals, encrypted channels cutting across former strike frequencies, and though his comm unit remained manually disabled, the external spectrum analyzer on his wrist unit pulsed with incoming traffic strong enough to bleed through passive sensors. Aelira drew in a slow breath, steadier than before, and the faint lines of light beneath her skin shimmered once more before settling into a calm, rhythmic glow. "They have recognized my signature," she said, her voice quiet but no longer strained. "The sweep is cancelled." Caleb finally reached up and reactivated his comm system, the channel, opening with a burst of static before locking onto a priority override tone he had never heard in 10 years of service. A command voice followed, clipped and controlled but edged with something unmistakable. "All units, stand down from Sector 7. Repeat, stand down. Orbital action suspended pending diplomatic review." He stared at the scrolling data, heart rate gradually dropping from its previous spike, and felt the weight of what had just happened settle in. 8 seconds from impact, and the sky had been ordered to wait. He looked back at Aelira, studying her more carefully now that the immediate threat had passed. The metallic band at her collarbone emitted a faint harmonic pulse that his suit translated as a high-level command beacon, far beyond standard field issue. "You are not just a civilian," he said quietly. She held his gaze without flinching. "No." The word carried no pride, only fact. "My designation is Strategic Heir to the Northern Coalition. My presence in this engagement was not meant to be public." A distant shape broke through the cloud cover far above, sleek and angular, its hull reflecting the fading light as it altered course toward their position but maintained altitude. It did not descend aggressively. It hovered, engines humming at a controlled idle, as if awaiting confirmation rather than asserting dominance. Caleb felt the shift in power dynamics as clearly as a change in weather pressure. Minutes ago she had been a wounded figure abandoned on open ground. Now unseen fleets adjusted their trajectories because she had spoken. "Your people left you," he said, not accusing, only stating what he had witnessed. Aelira's eyes lowered briefly before lifting again. "They withdrew under direct order to preserve strategic assets," she replied. "I was assessed as unrecoverable within acceptable risk parameters." The clinical phrasing hung in the air between them. Caleb exhaled slowly. "That is one way to calculate value," he said. The craft above dipped slightly, projecting a narrow beam that scanned the ravine without emitting heat or force, only data. His HUD displayed a handshake request from an unknown alien command channel, flagged as non-hostile. He hesitated only a moment before granting limited access. The beam brightened around Aelira's form, then softened. A new transmission replaced the previous human override, the voice deeper, resonant, filtered through layers of translation algorithms. "Human soldier," it said evenly, "you have interfered with a battlefield protocol. Yet you have preserved a life deemed beyond recovery. State your intent." Caleb remained kneeling in the dirt, armor scraped, power reserves low, and looked from the hovering craft to the young alien beside him. "My intent," he answered without raising his voice, "was simple. She was still alive." The wind shifted again, lifting fine grains of sand into the air, And in that quiet space between orders and outcomes, he realized the question was no longer why he had stayed, but what staying had changed. The alien voice did not answer immediately, and in that suspended moment Caleb became acutely aware of every small detail around him. The way the wind traced thin lines through the loose sand at the edge of the ravine, the faint ticking of his cooling system recalibrating after prolonged strain, the soft but steady rhythm of Illyra's breathing beside him. The hovering craft above shifted position by no more than a few feet, engines adjusting with precise control, its silhouette sharp against the fading sky. When the translated voice returned, it carried a tone that was less interrogative and more contemplative. Life, it repeated, as if testing the word for hidden layers. You prioritized a single life over operational certainty. Caleb kept his posture steady, one knee in the dirt, hands visible and open to signal that he posed no immediate threat. Yes, he said simply. There was a pause long enough for the air to cool another degree as evening settled across the plain. His suit sensors displayed updated atmospheric readings and an advisory from Human Command requesting status confirmation. He ignored it for the moment. Illyra shifted slightly, propping herself up with more strength than before, the faint glow beneath her skin pulsing in response to the craft above. High Executor, she said toward the sky, her voice firm despite fatigue. This human acted without expectation of gain. He was unaware of my designation. The beam from the craft narrowed, focusing more tightly on her metallic band, and Caleb watched as complex data streams scrolled across his visor, alien encryption layered over diplomatic flags now emerging on shared channels. Confirmation received, the voice replied. Strategic Heir Illyra is to be retrieved under non-hostile parameters. Human soldier is to remain unharmed. The last phrase hung in the air with quiet emphasis. Caleb exhaled slowly, not in relief but in acknowledgement that events had moved beyond the narrow ravine and into a larger arena neither of them had planned for. In his earpiece, Human Command broke through at last, the tone urgent but controlled. Sergeant Hayes, this is Central. Stand by for diplomatic extraction protocol. Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage. He almost smiled at the redundancy. There had never been any intent to engage. The craft above began a measured descent, not all the way to the ground, but close enough that a secondary platform extended downward, unfolding with mechanical precision. Soft white lights illuminated the ravine without harsh glare, bathing Illyra in a gentle glow that highlighted the subtle contours of her pale blue skin and the steadiness returning to her gaze. Caleb rose carefully and extended a hand to help her stand. She hesitated only a fraction of a second before accepting it, her grip firm despite her earlier weakness. You have altered more than a battlefield outcome, she said quietly, close enough now that he could hear her without the translator's delay. You have altered perception. He guided her toward the base of the descending platform, aware that cameras and sensors from both fleets were recording every movement. I did not plan to, he replied. Most significant changes are not planned, she said. As the platform reached the ground, a subtle hum vibrated through the soil, and a faint protective field formed around its perimeter. Caleb stepped back half a pace, instinctively granting her the lead. She turned once more before stepping onto it, golden eyes meeting his through the transparent shield of his visor. There was no longer disbelief in her expression, only resolve. You chose when others calculated, she said. That distinction will not be forgotten. The platform began to rise smoothly, carrying her upward toward the waiting craft, and Caleb remained in the ravine, armor scuffed, power reserves low, watching as the sky that had once threatened to erase them now opened to receive her under entirely different terms. The platform carried Illyra upward with measured grace, its white perimeter lights dimming as it neared the underside of the hovering craft, and Caleb remained where he was at the base of the ravine, boots planted in cooling soil, watching until the last trace of pale blue disappeared behind the seamless hull. The craft lingered for a moment, engines humming at a steady pitch that vibrated faintly through the air, then began to ascend with controlled acceleration, climbing several hundred feet before angling away from the battlefield entirely. As it departed, the copper haze of evening reclaimed the sky, erasing the sharp silhouette and leaving only open atmosphere in its place. Caleb's visor cleared of alien transmission overlays and reverted to standard tactical display, though new diplomatic flags blinked persistently at the edge of his vision. In his earpiece, human command returned with a tone that was no longer urgent but strained in a different way. Sergeant Hayes, remain in position. A retrieval shuttle is inbound. You are to be debriefed immediately upon extraction. He glanced once more at the empty sky, then down at the shallow groove his boots had carved into the earth while he had waited. Understood, he replied evenly. The wind had shifted direction, carrying cooler air across the plain, and without the tension of impending strike the landscape looked almost ordinary, a stretch of barren ground extending for miles with scattered debris glinting faintly in the fading light. His suit power indicator dipped to 28%, a reminder that choice carried cost even when it did not carry immediate consequence. Within minutes, a familiar shape broke the horizon from the west, human in design, angular and utilitarian, descending in a controlled arc until it hovered just above the ravine. A ramp extended downward with a mechanical whine, and two medics stepped out, their armor unmarked, expressions hidden behind clear visors. They scanned him first, then the surrounding terrain, as if expecting resistance that did not come. You alone, Sergeant? One of them asked. Caleb nodded. Alone. He stepped onto the ramp without ceremony, feeling the subtle vibration of the shuttle's engines beneath his boots. As the craft lifted, the ravine shrank beneath him, becoming just another indentation in an endless expanse of land that had almost become a grave for two different reasons. Inside the shuttle, the medics ran quick diagnostics on his suit and vital signs, their movements efficient and professional. One of them hesitated before speaking. You realize this is going to reach levels far above our pay grade. Caleb removed his helmet at last, cool recycled air brushing against skin that had been sealed off for hours. His pale complexion looked drawn under the cabin lights, but his eyes were steady. It already has, he said. Through the small viewport, he could see distant lights flicker along the upper atmosphere, not from weapon systems, but from ships repositioning into new formations, cautious rather than aggressive. Lines that had been drawn in fire were being redrawn in silence. He leaned back against the bulkhead, exhaustion settling into his muscles now that adrenaline had faded, and let his thoughts drift briefly to the moment in the ravine when she had looked at him not as an enemy, but as a variable that defied calculation. Somewhere above the planet's surface, negotiations were beginning because a single decision had interrupted an equation. Caleb closed his eyes for a few seconds, hearing again her quiet words about perception, about choosing when others calculated, and understood that whatever came next would not be confined to reports and reprimands. It would be measured in something far less tangible than territory. It would be measured in trust. By the time the shuttle touched down at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, night had fully settled across the desert, the sky a deep indigo scattered with unfamiliar constellations that shimmered faintly through atmospheric haze. The landing struts locked into place with a solid metallic thud, and Caleb rose from his seat as the rear hatch opened to a wash of cool air scented with dust and machine lubricant. Rows of portable floodlights illuminated the base perimeter, casting long shadows across temporary structures and communication arrays that blinked in disciplined rhythm. He stepped onto the tarmac with helmet tucked under one arm, boots striking the metal plating with a hollow echo that seemed louder than usual in the relative quiet. Waiting near the edge of the landing zone stood a small delegation rather than the standard debrief team, two human officers in formal field dress, and, several yards behind them, a trio of tall figures with pale armor that reflected the floodlights in soft, iridescent tones. The air felt charged, not with threat, but with scrutiny. One of the human officers, a colonel with silver at his temples and a rigid posture honed by decades of service, regarded Caleb with an expression that blended discipline and curiosity. Sergeant Hayes, he said evenly, you have been reassigned to diplomatic liaison pending further notice. The words were precise, almost careful, as if chosen to avoid implication of reprimand or praise. Caleb gave a short nod. Yes, sir. The colonel stepped aside slightly, revealing the alien delegation more clearly. Their armor bore subtle geometric patterns that glowed faintly along the seams, and though their faces were partially obscured by transparent visors, Their posture conveyed alert awareness rather than hostility. One of them moved forward with measured grace and lowered their head in a gesture that Caleb recognized from his suit's cultural database as a formal acknowledgement of respect. A translator device emitted a soft chime before rendering the voice into clear English. "Human soldier Caleb Hayes," it said, "the Strategic Heir has conveyed her testimony to our High Council. Your actions have been verified." Caleb felt the weight of the entire base watching from a distance, technicians pausing beside equipment, pilots standing at the edge of hangars, all aware that something beyond routine procedure was unfolding under the bright lights. "She is stable?" he asked before he could stop himself. The alien figure inclined its head slightly. "She is receiving care aboard our flagship. Her recovery is proceeding within optimal parameters." Relief passed through him quietly, not dramatic, just a subtle easing in his shoulders. The colonel folded his hands behind his back. "A temporary ceasefire has been negotiated in this sector," he said. "Discussions are underway at levels above both of us. It appears that a field decision altered the trajectory of more than one engagement." Caleb looked past the delegation toward the dark horizon where the desert met the sky, remembering the ravine and the moment when the countdown had frozen. "I did what I thought was right," he said simply. The alien representative stepped closer, enough that Caleb could see faint lines of light beneath their pale skin similar to Illyra's, pulsing in steady rhythm. "In our calculations," the translator rendered, "risk is weighed against outcome. You introduced a variable that does not conform to our models. That variable is now under study." The colonel allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile. "Congratulations, Sergeant," he said quietly. "You are now officially unpredictable." The base lights hummed overhead. Engines roared faintly from distant hangars, and somewhere high above, ships from two civilizations maintained careful distance instead of closing in. Caleb stood there between uniforms and alien armor, aware that he was no longer just a soldier returning from a mission but a bridge that had formed without permission. And for the first time since the ravine, he understood that staying had not been the end of something, but the beginning. 3 days later, the desert no longer felt like a battlefield, but like a border drawn in careful pencil rather than fire. And Caleb stood at the edge of forward operating base Sentinel as dawn stretched pale gold across the horizon, the cool morning air carrying the faint scent of sand and engine exhaust. A temporary diplomatic corridor had been established half a mile beyond the perimeter, marked not by barricades, but by coordinated beacons from both sides. Soft white lights pulsing in synchronized rhythm as if rehearsing trust. He adjusted the collar of his freshly issued liaison uniform, the fabric stiff and unfamiliar compared to field armor, and watched as a sleek alien transport descended through the thinning darkness with deliberate slowness. Its hull reflected the rising sun in muted tones, no weapons ports exposed, no aggressive posture in its approach. The base around him was unusually quiet, personnel observing from a respectful distance, aware that this meeting was less about strategy and more about meaning. The transport settled onto the sand without kicking up debris, landing with a controlled whisper rather than a roar, and a narrow ramp extended downward. Ailira appeared at the top of it, no longer supported by emergency medics or scanning beams, but walking on her own with steady steps. Her pale blue skin caught the early light, and the faint lines beneath it pulsed in calm, even intervals, a sign not of distress but of vitality. She wore simple ceremonial attire rather than armor, the fabric draping with understated elegance that spoke of status without spectacle. Caleb stepped forward to meet her, boots pressing into cool sand, and for a brief second he was aware of how improbable this moment would have seemed just days earlier when a countdown timer had nearly defined both their fates. She stopped a few feet from him, close enough that he could see the subtle shift of gold in her eyes as they reflected the sunrise. "Sergeant Caleb Hayes," she said, her voice clear without reliance on external amplification, the translator integrated seamlessly into her collar band. "The High Council has ratified a provisional ceasefire in this sector. Negotiations toward sustained peace are underway." He inclined his head slightly. "I am glad to hear it." She studied him with an expression that carried both intelligence and something warmer. "Your superiors have requested a formal explanation of your decision," she said. "My council requested the same from me." A faint breeze lifted a strand of her silver-tinted hair, and beyond them the beacons continued their quiet pulse. "And what did you tell them?" he asked. She did not look away. "I told them that when all calculations declared me expendable, one human assessed me differently. Not as asset or liability, but as a person." The word lingered between them with weight greater than any weapon. Caleb felt the early sunlight warming his face, pale skin contrasting against her cool blue tones, and understood that the contrast itself had become part of the message. "I did not know who you were," he said. "I only knew you were still breathing." Alira nodded once, slow and deliberate. "That distinction has altered more than my survival. It has altered policy." Behind her, the alien delegation stood at ease. Behind him, human officers observed without interruption. The desert stretched open and quiet, no longer vibrating with engines aligned for destruction, but with ships holding position at respectful distance. "In our records," she continued softly, "this engagement will not be defined by territory gained or lost. It will be defined by a refusal to leave someone alone." Caleb looked out across the sand where the ravine lay hidden beyond sight, a small indentation in a vast landscape that had become the origin of something neither side had anticipated. He felt no triumph, only a steady sense of rightness. "Then that is enough," he said. The sun rose higher, light spilling across blue skin and white, across uniforms and ceremonial fabric, across a place that had nearly been reduced to numbers on a screen. And in the stillness that followed, it was clear that sometimes the smallest act of staying can redraw the map of a galaxy without a single shot being fired.